Elena's breaths came shallow, shallow enough that she thought perhaps Ranger might sense them, even in the dark. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, trying to disappear into its folds. She had been told to stay quiet, to say nothing, to avoid the piercing eyes of the woman who had offered her refuge. But staying silent was harder than she imagined. Ranger, once a police dog of unmatched skill, lay at the edge of the doorway, alert but motionless. The air around him seemed charged, a quiet tension that warned any intruder of his presence. He had protected countless lives in his prime, and now, retired though he might be, his instincts had found a new mission. This fragile child, whose life had already been stolen once. Margaret's voice, barely audible, told stories of grief and perseverance, of nights spent watching over the dying, of lives lost in quiet anonymity. Elena listened, eyes wide but cheeks wet with unshed tears, realizing that vulnerability didn't always mean weakness. In this room, amid the darkness and the stillness, something extraordinary was taking shape. A bond stronger than fear, woven from shared sorrow and unspoken understanding. Tonight, Elena would learn that protection could come in the form of fur, patience, and unwavering loyalty, and that even in silence, a promise could be heard. The morning had that muted stillness only late autumn could bring. The kind of stillness where every sound seemed swallowed by the fog, where breath hung in the air a moment too long before dissolving into nothing. Out beyond the windshield of the black Porsche, the trees of rural America rose like ghostly pillars. Their bare branches reached skyward, sharp and skeletal, disappearing into a curtain of silver mist. The road was narrow, cracked in places where roots had broken through the asphalt, winding deeper into the forgotten woods. Victor Hale held the wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale against the leather trim. He was dressed immaculately despite the setting, a charcoal grey suit, starched white shirt, silk tie that had cost more than most men's paychecks. His wristwatch gleamed faintly in the dim light, ticking steadily like a metronome marking time. Everything about him was polished, controlled, deliberate. Everything, except the silence. In the back seat, 10-year-old Elena sat strapped into her wheelchair, which Victor had folded tightly to fit against the leather seats. Her legs, thin and unmoving beneath woolen tights, were covered with a plaid blanket. She clutched its edge as though it were a shield. Her wide brown eyes traced the mist curling against the car windows, the trees flashing by in blurred silhouettes. There was a strangeness to this trip. She had sensed it from the moment her father told her to dress quickly that morning. No explanation, no breakfast, just, "We're going for a drive." Usually, rides with him were rare. He was a man of offices, airports, meetings that stretched past midnight. When he did appear at home, it was with an aura of distraction, as though his mind was forever occupied elsewhere. But today, there was no phone pressed to his ear, no conversation with unseen voices, just silence, cold, thick and heavy, like the fog outside. Elena tried to look at his face in the rearview mirror. His jaw was clenched, his eyes locked forward with an expression that made her stomach twist. It wasn't the usual impatience or annoyance she knew well. This was something quieter, something final. Her heart began to beat faster. "Daddy?" she asked softly. Her voice seemed too small in the leather-wrapped interior. "Where are we going?" Victor didn't answer. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint hiss of tires over damp pavement. Eleanor pressed herself back into the seat, fingers tightening around the blanket. A prickle of fear slid up her spine. She knew this silence. She had seen it before, the same hard set of his mouth when he was about to close a deal. when he had already decided the outcome and nothing could change it. She tried again, this time her voice thinner, almost breaking. "Daddy, are you mad at me?" His eyes flicked up to the mirror for half a heartbeat, then away. "No," he said finally, his tone flat as steel. Just one word, clipped, cold. The kind of voice that left no room for further questions. But the single word didn't soothe her. If anything, it deepened the dread curling inside her chest. Eleanor turned her gaze to the fog outside, trying to slow her breathing. The forest pressed close on either side of the road. It felt endless, like they were driving into a place where no one could find them. She remembered overhearing late-night arguments between her father and the woman who now filled her mother's place in their house. Words like expenses, burden, treatment costs. Words she wasn't supposed to understand. But she did. Her throat tightened. She wished, more than anything, her mother was still alive. Her mother's presence had been soft hands and warm lullabies, the steady comfort of someone who saw her not as a broken thing, but as her daughter. But her mother was gone, and in her place was a man who hadn't smiled at her in months, who looked at her sometimes as if she were the weight that bent his back. The Porsche rounded a curve, its headlights slicing through the mist. For a moment, the road ahead was swallowed in grey nothingness, the world reduced to two figures in a car, one calculating, one terrified. Elena hugged the blanket tighter. She could feel the tremor in her own hands. Something was wrong. She didn't know what, but her body knew. The silence wasn't just silence. It was a decision hanging in the air, waiting to fall like an axe. "Daddy?" She tried again, a whisper now, fragile as the fog itself. "Can we go home?" But there was no answer, not even a flicker in his expression. Just the steady grip on the wheel, the relentless forward motion into the woods. The fog thickened, wrapping the car like a shroud. The trees grew denser, leaning in as though to watch. Elena's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, leaving a faint circle of condensation. Beyond the blur of trees, she thought she saw something move. A deer, maybe, or just a trick of the mist. The forest seemed alive, listening, waiting. In that moment, Eleanor's small voice broke through again, choked with tears she hadn't meant to shed. "Please, don't be mad at me, Daddy." "I'll be good, I promise." Victor said nothing. His eyes, dark and unreadable, remained on the endless ribbon of road. And in the stillness that followed, Elena's heart told her what her mind couldn't yet accept. They weren't just going for a drive. Something inside her whispered that this road was carrying her away from everything she had known, and not toward home. The Porsche slowed, its engine purring low as the mist grew thicker, wrapping the road like a shroud. Victor flicked on the blinker, though no cars followed. No one watched. He steered the car toward a small clearing where the trees bowed away from the asphalt. The tires crunched against gravel as the car rolled to a stop. Elena lifted her head, confused. "Why are we stopping?" Her voice trembled, barely louder than the hum of the engine. Victor didn't answer right away. He placed the gear shift in park, leaned back against the seat, and exhaled a long, controlled breath. His eyes never once softened when they flicked toward the fog. To him, the silence seemed strategic, like he was already halfway out of this moment, his mind on something else entirely. To Eleanor, it was a silence that felt like the edge of a cliff. He forced a smile, brittle and false. "Just a scenic stop," he said flatly. "Take in some fresh air." The words felt wrong. He never cared about fresh air. never about scenery. Elena's stomach clenched. She tried to believe him, tried to push down the gnawing dread, but her heart drummed too loudly against her ribs. Victor got out, the door clicking shut with a sound that echoed unnaturally in the emptiness. A gust of cold fog swept inside before the door sealed. Elena sat stiffly in her wheelchair, listening to his footsteps crunch over gravel as he walked around the car. The rear door opened. Cold air flooded in, biting at her cheeks. He leaned in, his face impassive, his hands practiced as he unlocked the chair's restraints. Without a word, he pulled her and the wheelchair together from the car, with the same mechanical efficiency he reserved for moving luggage. The blanket slipped from her lap and snagged against the doorframe, dragging in the dirt. "Daddy?" Her small voice cracked. He didn't respond. He rolled her forward across the uneven ground until they reached the edge of the road. The mist swirled around them, swallowing the tree line in gray. Victor stopped, his polished shoes pressing into the damp leaves. For a moment, he adjusted his tie, fingers straightening silk like it was the only thing that mattered. Then he looked down at her. His eyes were cold, hard, empty. "You've become a burden too heavy to carry," he said. The words struck her like a physical blow. Elena's breath caught, her chest squeezing as though the fog itself pressed down. "What?" Her voice wavered, disbelieving. "You take too much," Victor continued, his tone detached, like he was reading numbers off a ledger. "Too much money, too much time, too much attention. I won't keep doing this. Daddy, please." Tears welled hot in her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand, desperate to touch him, to remind him she was his daughter. "I'll try harder. I'll be good. I promise." He stepped back, out of reach, as though her fingers carried a stain he couldn't afford. "No," he said coldly. "This is where it ends." Her sobs broke free, sharp and pleading. "Don't leave me. Please, Daddy, please don't." But he had already turned. His back was rigid, his stride deliberate as he walked away through the mist. His hand reached for the car door, his movements smooth and practiced, a man used to shutting out what he didn't want to see. "Daddy!" Elena screamed, her voice raw, echoing through the fog. Her hands clawed at the sides of the wheelchair, trying to push herself forward, though the wheels only shuddered in the dirt. "Don't leave me here! Don't go!" He didn't stop, didn't turn. The Porsche door slammed. A second later, the growl of the engine roared to life, louder than the forest, louder than her sobs. The headlights cut two beams through the mist, blinding for an instant, then swung away as the car turned back onto the road. Elena's cries grew frantic, her throat burning as she screamed until her voice cracked. "Daddy, come back. Don't leave me." Her small fists pounded against the armrests of her chair, useless, powerless. The car accelerated. The red taillights faded into the fog like a dying ember, swallowed by the gray. And then there was nothing. No hum of an engine, no glimpse of light, no trace that he had ever been there. Only the echo of her screams, torn away by the silence. The mist pressed closer, damp and suffocating. Elena's body shook with sobs. Her chest heaved, and she tasted salt and iron from the rawness in her throat. Her blanket lay crumpled in the dirt beside her, streaked with mud. She bent forward, reaching for it with trembling fingers, clutching it to her chest as though it were the last thread tying her to safety. The forest answered with silence, not a bird call, not the rustle of leaves, only her shallow gasps and the racing thud of her heart. She looked down at her legs, at the chair that bound her, and terror clawed at her ribs. How long until nightfall? How long before the cold sank into her bones? She imagined shapes moving in the fog, imagined wild eyes watching from the shadows. Her sobs softened into whispers, desperate words broken by hiccuping breaths. "Mom, please, please don't let him leave me. Please come back." She pressed her face into the blanket, rocking slightly, a child searching for comfort that wasn't there. But there was no answer, only the cruel truth of the fog. Victor Hale was gone. The sound of the Porsche faded until it was nothing, not even an echo. The mist swallowed the last trace of its engine, leaving Elena in a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had abandoned her. She sat frozen in her wheelchair, small hands gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles turned white. The blanket she had clutched slipped halfway down her lap, catching on one of the wheels, stained with mud. She didn't bother fixing it. Her body trembled with sobs, each one rattling through her chest like it might break her. The forest loomed all around, its trees standing tall and indifferent. They leaned inward, skeletal branches knitting above her like ribs closing over a fragile heart. The mist clung to the ground, curling around the chair's wheels, wrapping her in dampness until her skin prickled. She was a child swallowed by the wilderness, voiceless, powerless, forgotten. Eleanor's breathing hitched. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The sudden crack of a twig far in the distance, the faint flutter of wings overhead, the low creak of branches shifting under their own weight. She flinched at each noise, her imagination painting them into threats. Was it a fox? A wolf? A bear moving through the grey? The forest, once distant background in her life, now pressed in on her as a predator might, unseen, yet waiting. Her tears blurred her vision, turning the fog into something alive, shifting, whispering. She tried to wipe her face with the back of her sleeve, but her hand trembled too much. Salt burned her skin where tears mixed with the chill of the air. "Daddy," she whispered hoarsely, the word tearing itself from her throat, though she knew he wouldn't return. It was instinct more than hope, the desperate cry of a child clinging to denial. "Daddy, please." The mist answered with silence. Elena bent forward, her forehead pressing into the edge of the blanket. Her shoulders shook violently, and she tried to make herself small, as if shrinking could hide her from the world. Sobs became gasps. Gasps became hiccups, until finally only shallow breathing remained. Her chest ached, her throat raw, but still her lips moved, searching for something, someone else. "Mom," she whispered, barely audible, the word almost lost in the damp air. "Mom, please." The name tasted like memory. Her mother's voice had been warm honey, her touch a steady anchor. Elena remembered the way her mother had brushed her hair before school, the way her laughter could fill a room, the way her eyes softened whenever they looked at her daughter's legs and chose to see strength instead of weakness. But all of that was gone now, torn away in what they had called an accident. Elena pressed her face deeper into the blanket, rocking slightly in her chair as if she could summon her mother's arms around her. "Don't leave me too. Please don't leave me." The grief cracked something deeper inside. Beneath the fear of wolves and darkness lay a wound larger than the forest, larger than the silence. The knowledge that she had been abandoned twice, once by death, and now, crueler still, by choice. The afternoon light was fading. Already the grey was darkening to slate, and the fog glowed less with the sun and more with its own pale gloom. Shadows thickened between the trees, and the cold bit harder. Elena pulled the blanket tighter across her lap, shivering as wind hissed through branches. She tried to listen for the hum of another car, any car, that might stumble across this lonely road. But there was nothing. Only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Too loud, too fast. Her mind spun with possibilities. What if no one came? What if night fell and she was still here, alone, trapped in her chair as the animals crept closer? She had seen pictures of coyotes in her school books, sharp-toothed and hungry-eyed. Her breath came quicker at the thought of them sniffing the air, drawn to the smell of her fear. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the image away, whispering again, "Mom, please, I need you." The fog shifted with the wind, and for a fleeting moment, Elena almost imagined she heard something. Her mother's lullaby, carried faintly like an echo in the trees. It was gone as soon as it came, but it left her clinging to the sound, her heart aching with longing. Her sobs slowed, exhaustion weighing down on her like stones. She leaned back in the chair, her small body sinking into it as though it could swallow her. Her lashes were sticky with tears, her cheeks red and raw. Every breath came shallow, trembling. Minutes passed, though to her they felt like hours. The silence was no longer just outside. It had seeped into her bones, numbing her, making her feel hollow. At last she whispered one more time, broken but steady, "Mom, don't let me disappear." Her words vanished into the mist, unanswered, unheard, except by the forest itself, which stood unmoving, ancient and indifferent. Elena closed her eyes. She was still crying, though no sound escaped her lips. In that lonely clearing, the abandoned child in her wheelchair looked smaller than ever, a fragile silhouette swallowed by fog. And yet, somewhere deep in that silence, something stirred. The forest was not done with her. The road had not been her ending, not yet. The silence had grown unbearable. Elena's sobs had quieted into broken hiccups, her voice raw from crying, her body slumped forward in the wheelchair. The fog pressed around her, thick and smothering, and she began to believe no one would ever come. And then, bark! The sound cut through the stillness like a sudden crack of thunder, sharp, commanding, alive. Elena's head jerked up, eyes wide. For a heartbeat, fear spiked in her chest. Was it a wild dog? A wolf? Her small hands tightened on the blanket, holding it against her chest like armor. The sound came again, closer this time. One sharp bark, then silence, followed by the faint rhythm of footsteps crunching against the gravel. She froze, breath shallow, ears straining. Out of the swirling mist, a shape materialized, large, powerful, deliberate in its movements. The fog parted just enough to reveal the silhouette of a German shepherd. His ears stood alert, his tail low but steady. Every line of his body broadcasting discipline. Across his chest, faintly visible under the wear of time, clung an old black tactical vest. The words "Police K9" were stitched in faded white letters, scuffed from years of service. Elena gasped, pressing back into her chair. She didn't know whether to be more afraid or relieved. The dog's amber eyes caught the dim light, sharp and assessing, but not cruel. He stopped a few feet away, stance low, as though weighing her presence. A soft growl rumbled from his throat. Not threatening, more a warning to anything unseen in the fog. Elena whispered, trembling, "Are you here for me?" The shepherd tilted his head as if listening. Then, with surprising gentleness, he gave a softer bark, almost questioning, before stepping forward one measured pace. Behind him, the mist stirred again. Another figure emerged, slender, slightly stooped, but steady. A woman, her hair a crown of silver pulled into a practical bun, her coat buttoned against the chill. Her eyes, sharp yet kind, scanned the road before they fell on the fragile silhouette of the girl in the wheelchair. Concern immediately softened her face. "Oh dear Lord," she breathed, quickening her pace. "A child?" Eleanor blinked through tears, overwhelmed. She wanted to call out, but fear tangled with relief in her throat. She could only stare as the woman approached, the shepherd circling protectively between them as though guiding her forward. The woman stopped a foot away, lowering herself slightly to Elena's level. Her voice came gentle, steady, the kind of tone one used with frightened patience. "Sweetheart, are you all right? What happened?" The words broke the last thread of Elena's composure. Tears welled up again, spilling down her cheeks. He left me." Her voice cracked, small and fractured. "My daddy left me." The woman's breath caught, her hand pressing to her chest. She closed her eyes a moment, as though steadying her own heart, then reached carefully toward the girl. "My name is Margaret," she said softly. "I live not far from here. This is Ranger." She gestured to the shepherd, who had now lowered himself beside the chair, eyes scanning the tree line. "We won't hurt you. You're safe now." But Elena recoiled, clutching the blanket tighter. "Don't take me back," she whispered, panic lacing her voice. "Please, don't let him find me." Margaret's face softened further. She shook her head quickly. "No, child. No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Not tonight. Not ever again." Her hand hovered near Elena's trembling ones but didn't touch, waiting for permission. "You've been through something terrible, haven't you?" Eleanor nodded, small and broken, unable to speak more. Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, firm but gentle, his warm breath puffing against her skin. Eleanor startled, then blinked, looking down at him. His amber eyes held hers steadily, patient and unyielding, like he was telling her in a language beyond words. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." For the first time since her father's betrayal, Eleanor felt a flicker of warmth stir in her chest. Tentatively, her fingers loosened from the blanket, reaching out. Her palm touched his coarse fur. The shepherd held still, letting her. Margaret let out a quiet breath of relief. "See, Ranger knows good souls, and he doesn't leave anyone behind." The forest remained hushed around them, but the danger Eleanor felt before seemed less sharp now, the shadows less threatening. Between Margaret's calm presence and Ranger's steady stance, the fog no longer felt like a tomb, but a veil being lifted. Margaret straightened gently. "Let's not stay here, sweetheart. You're shivering." Her eyes searched Elena's pale face. "Come with me. My cottage is warm. I'll take care of you." Elena hesitated, fear still anchoring her. She looked at the road behind, swallowed by fog and the emptiness that had consumed her minutes earlier. Then she looked back at the woman's kind eyes and Ranger's unwavering gaze. Her voice trembled. "Promise you won't take me back?" Margaret bent lower, pressing her hand over her heart. "I promise, child. You're safe with me." And though her trust had been shattered only hours earlier, Elena felt something stir, something fragile, something hesitant, but something alive. Her hand stayed resting on Ranger's fur, as if drawing strength from him. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe she might not be alone. Margaret's breath came faster as she knelt before the wheelchair. The fog clung to her hair, dampening the silver strands against her cheeks, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes locked on the girl, pale, trembling, tears cutting rivers down her face. She looked impossibly small beneath the plaid blanket, like a bird with a broken wing left in the cold. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice soft as a lullaby. "You shouldn't be out here alone." She reached carefully for the thin frame of the child, but the moment her arms touched Elena's shoulders, the girl stiffened. Panic flashed in her eyes. "No!" Elena's cry was high and raw. She tried to pull away, though her fragile body had little strength. Her hands clutched the blanket tighter, her voice breaking into desperate whispers. "Don't take me back. Please. Please don't take me back." Margaret froze, her arms still hovering. The words struck her like a blade. Whoever had abandoned this child, whoever back meant, was not safety. She pulled in a steadying breath, then softened her posture. "Hush now," she murmured, her voice low and certain. "I'm not taking you anywhere you don't want to go. You hear me? Not back, not away. Just somewhere warm." Elena's chest heaved, her breaths sharp and shallow. The fear in her eyes was bottomless, like someone who had already lost everything once and could not bear to lose more. At that moment, Ranger moved. The shepherd stepped forward, paws silent against the damp earth, and pressed his muzzle against Elena's arm. He nudged once, firm but gentle, his warm breath tickling her skin. Elena startled. Her first instinct was to recoil, but when she met Ranger's amber eyes, steady, patient, full of something that felt like promise, her hands loosened. He didn't flinch at her trembling or shy from her tears. He simply stayed, nudging her again, a silent insistence that she wasn't alone. Elena's lips trembled. Slowly, shakily, one hand slipped free of the blanket and hovered uncertainly over his head. She touched his fur with her fingertips, tentative, like she might burn, but Ranger didn't move away. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his head into her palm as though sealing an agreement. The smallest sound escaped Elena, a gasp, half sob, half relief. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She had seen this before, in hospital rooms where children lay clinging to life, where no medicine could reach the wounds inside their hearts. Sometimes it took something beyond words, a hand held, a presence steady, an animal's unspoken loyalty, to open the locked doors of trust. "There you go," Margaret said gently, watching the girl's hand settle in Ranger's fur. "That's right. He's a good boy. He won't let anyone hurt you." Eleanor's fingers curled, clutching Ranger's fur as though anchoring herself. Her tears hadn't stopped, but her breathing slowed. She still shook, but now she wasn't shaking alone. Margaret took that moment to act. Carefully, she slipped her arms under Eleanor's slight body. The child flinched at the touch, gasping, "No, don't." But Margaret's voice steadied her, warm and unyielding. "Shh, sweetheart. I've got you. I'm not taking you back, just somewhere safe." She lifted, surprised at how light Eleanor was, how fragile her bones felt under skin. It was like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in sorrow. The girl's arms pressed tightly against her chest, resisting at first, but Margaret held firm, rocking her slightly as though soothing a baby. "You're safe," she murmured. "You're safe now." Eleanor buried her face against Margaret's shoulder, muffling her sobs. Her words came muffled, trembling. He left me here." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart twisting. She didn't ask who. The pain in those 3 words was enough. Ranger padded alongside them, close, brushing his body against Margaret's leg as if to steady them both. He glanced up at Elena, his ears flicking back in sympathy, his eyes never leaving her. The walk back to the cottage was slow. The mist hung heavier, muffling the sound of Margaret's boots against gravel. the rustle of the blanket dragging at her side. Elena's weight was not much, but Margaret bore the gravity of something far heavier, the trust of a child handed, trembling, into her arms. "You're safe with me," she repeated softly, every few steps, as though words alone could stitch together the jagged tear in the girl's spirit. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." At the sound of those words, Eleanor's grip on Margaret's coat loosened slightly, her body yielding just a little into the woman's hold. And though she whispered again, "Don't take me back," her tone was softer now, less desperate plea and more fragile hope, that maybe, just maybe, this stranger meant what she said. Ranger gave a quiet bark. Not sharp this time, but low, almost approving. Elena's head turned at the sound. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes, still frightened, still uncertain, flickered with something else too. Recognition, trust, fragile and new, but trust all the same. Margaret tightened her arms, feeling the girl's heartbeat against her own. "You hear him, sweetheart? That's his promise too. He stays. Always." And for the first time since the Porsche disappeared into the fog, Elena let out a sound that wasn't sob or scream. A tiny sigh. The kind of sound that comes when the body, even for one moment, believes it doesn't have to fight anymore. The path to Margaret's cottage was narrow, half swallowed by roots and fallen leaves. But Margaret knew every turn as if the forest itself had laid the trail for her. The mist hung low, curling at their feet, making the way ahead look endless. Yet with each step, Ranger padded ahead, pausing now and then to glance back, his ears flicking in quiet vigilance. Margaret held Elena close against her chest. The child was weightless, far too light for her age, but her trembling made her feel heavy with sorrow. Each time Elena whimpered or whispered, "Don't take me back," Margaret tightened her hold and whispered, "I promised, sweetheart. You're with me now." The fog thinned at last, giving way to the silhouette of a small wooden cottage tucked between tall pines. Its chimney leaned slightly, and ivy clung to one side like a green shawl. To most eyes, it would look like a forgotten relic, but to Margaret, it was home. Warm light glowed faintly through the windows, a beacon against the darkening grey. "There we are," she murmured, her breath misting the air. Safe and sound. Ranger trotted to the porch first, his nose low, scanning. He circled the perimeter once, muscles taut under his old vest, before returning to stand at the steps as if to say, "All clear." Only then did Margaret climb the wooden stairs, their boards creaking softly under her boots. The front door groaned as she nudged it open with her shoulder. Inside, the air was warmer, tinged with the comforting sense of wood smoke, herbs, and something faintly sweet. The room was small. A stone hearth against one wall, shelves lined with jars of dried plants and tins, and a sturdy table with mismatched chairs. It was simple, but it carried a kind of welcome Elena had never felt in her father's grand house of glass and marble. Margaret lowered Elena gently into a cushioned armchair by the fire. "There now," she said softly, tucking the plaid blanket snug around her. "You'll warm up here." Elena looked around, wide-eyed, still trembling. She clutched the blanket to her chest, wary, silent. Ranger settled at her side, laying his great head on the armrest of her chair, his amber eyes fixed on her face as if daring the shadows to come near. Margaret moved with the ease of long habit. She lit another lamp, stoked the fire until flames leapt brighter, then set a small pot on the stove. The rich scent of chicken broth soon filled the air, mingling with rosemary and thyme she sprinkled in. She hummed faintly, not to fill the silence, but to soften it. Elena watched her, suspicious at first, then curious despite herself. The girl's stomach ached with hunger, but pride and fear welded her lips shut. She had learned not to trust kindness. Kindness often came with conditions. Margaret carried a steaming bowl over, kneeling beside her. The fragrant soup swirled golden in the light. "Just a little," Margaret coaxed. "It'll help warm you." Eleanor shook her head sharply, pressing back into the chair. "No, I'm fine." Her voice was brittle, rehearsed, the words of a child who had spent too long convincing herself she needed nothing. Margaret didn't push. She simply set the bowl on the table beside her, close enough to tempt, far enough not to threaten. "That's all right," she said softly. "It'll wait for you." Minutes passed. The fire popped, Ranger's tail flicked against the floor, and Margaret busied herself with small tasks. She didn't stare or coax further. She simply let the warmth and safety of the room do what words could not. Elena shifted, sniffing at the air despite herself. Her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. She flushed, pulling the blanket tighter, ashamed. Margaret noticed but said nothing. Instead, she lifted a spoon, dipped it into the broth, and blew gently until steam curled away. Then she offered it, not forcing it near Elena's lips, but holding it patiently, steadily, like an open hand waiting to be taken. For a long moment, Elena's eyes flicked between the spoon, Margaret's weathered face, and Ranger's steady gaze. The dog nudged her knee once, as though encouraging her to try. Elena's hand trembled as she reached out, but instead of taking the spoon, she whispered, almost inaudible, "Promise you won't make me go back." Margaret leaned closer, her voice steady as stone. "On my life, child. You're safe here." Something cracked then, not loudly, but enough. Elena's lips parted, and she leaned forward. Margaret guided the spoon gently, and Elena took the smallest sip. The broth was hot, savory, and soothing against her raw throat. She swallowed, surprised by the comfort of it. Her eyes welled again, but this time not from fear. Margaret smiled faintly. "There now. Just a taste." Eleanor sniffled, her shoulders loosening as if a burden had shifted slightly off her chest. She nodded once, timidly, then allowed another spoonful. And another. Ranger wagged his tail, the faint thump-thump against the floorboards like applause. By the time the bowl was half empty, Elena's shivering had eased. Her cheeks glowed with warmth, and though her eyes still brimmed with sadness, there was a flicker, a fragile light that hadn't been there before. Margaret brushed a loose strand of hair from the girl's forehead with a trembling hand. "Good girl," she whispered. "You're safe now. You'll see." Eleanor leaned back against the chair, exhaustion pulling at her. Ranger pressed closer, his head heavy against her lap, and for the first time since the road, she let her small fingers curl into his fur. And though fear still clung to her like mist, that night in the cottage marked something new, the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. The cottage settled into night with the steady rhythm of the fire's crackle. Outside, the forest groaned in the wind, branches creaking against each other, but inside the little home there was warmth, though not yet peace. Eleanor sat curled in the armchair Margaret had placed near the hearth. The plaid blanket was pulled tightly around her shoulders, cocooning her small frame. Her wide eyes, still rimmed red from hours of crying, stared not at Margaret nor at Ranger, but into the shifting flames as though they alone could keep her anchored. Margaret had offered the girl a proper bed, soft sheets, a quilt sewn with her own hands, but Eleanor had shaken her head fiercely, refusing to move from the chair, so Margaret let her stay. Some wounds were not to be forced open. On the floorboards near the door, Ranger lay stretched across the threshold like a sentinel. His ears twitched at every creak outside, his amber eyes half closed, but never fully at rest. Anyone, or anything, that tried to come through that door would have to go through him first. His steady breathing filled the space with a presence stronger than locks, stronger than walls. Margaret busied herself in the small kitchen alcove, moving slowly, deliberately, giving Elena space. She washed the dishes from their simple meal, dried them, and set them neatly back on the shelf. Yet her eyes strayed often to the child by the fire, her heart heavy. The silence between them was fragile, the kind that could either fracture or deepen, depending on what one dared to say. At last, Margaret crossed to the rocking chair opposite Elena. She sat with a sigh, her bones weary, but her spirit alert. She reached for her knitting basket, pulling out a half-finished scarf. The needles clicked softly, the rhythmic sound joining the fire's crackle. She did not look directly at Eleanor, but her voice, when it came, was gentle, like she was speaking to the flames, not the child. "I used to sit like this," she began, her tone low and even, "many nights after long shifts at the hospital. Sometimes I'd come home still wearing the scent of disinfectant and sorrow. Sometimes I'd sit by the fire and feel the weight of all the faces I couldn't save." The needles clicked again, her hands working steadily. "I was a nurse for 40 years, sweetheart, and if there's one thing I learned, it's that silence can be the heaviest thing in a room. It presses on your chest, makes you feel you're drowning in things left unsaid." Eleanor's eyes flickered, just barely, from the fire toward Margaret. Her lips pressed tighter together. She pulled the blanket higher, hiding her chin. Margaret noticed but didn't push. She continued softly. "There were nights I'd come home and not say a word to my husband. He was a police officer, used to seeing darkness in people. But even then, there were things too heavy for words. Sometimes the only sound in the house was his dog snoring at our feet." At the mention of the dog, Ranger lifted his head. His ears perked, as though he knew the story included his kind. His eyes sought Elena, watching carefully, reading the child's every breath the way only a dog could. Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze still on the fire. That dog would lie by the door, just like Ranger there. Wouldn't move an inch, even if the house shook with storm. It was his way of telling us, "Rest. I've got you." The scarf in her hands grew longer with each stitch, the steady rhythm like a heartbeat in the quiet room. Margaret's eyes softened, her voice lower now. "When my husband died on duty, it was that dog who laid his head on my lap and let me cry. He didn't speak, didn't ask me to explain. Just stayed. Sometimes that's what saves us, not the words, but the presence." For a long moment, only the fire answered. The flames bent and hissed, sending tiny sparks upward. Elena's eyes shimmered, her lips parting as though she might speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She clutched the blanket tighter, a fortress of fabric. Ranger gave a quiet huff, shifting closer to the girl's chair. His tail brushed the rug, slow and steady. He did not demand her attention, only made sure she felt him there. Margaret set her knitting aside and folded her hands in her lap. She let out a long sigh, heavy with memory. "It's all right if you don't want to talk, Elena. Sometimes silence is all we can manage. But you should know, you don't have to fill it alone anymore. Not while you're here." The child's head turned sharply at the sound of her name. Her eyes widened in surprise. She had never told Margaret what to call her. Margaret noticed and offered a small, knowing smile. You whispered it when you were half asleep earlier, she explained gently. Elena. It's a beautiful name. Elena's throat worked as if she might answer, but no sound came. Instead, her eyes brimmed again, and she turned back toward the fire, blinking furiously. Margaret rose slowly from her chair and draped another quilt across the girl's knees. Rest, child, she whispered. Ranger will watch the door, and I'll be right here. You're safe tonight. Elena shifted in her chair, her small body curling inward, but this time she did not resist the warmth. Her fingers found their way into Ranger's fur, clinging lightly. Her lips moved, though only a whisper escaped, meant for herself alone. Mama. Margaret heard it, though she pretended she hadn't. She simply reached for her knitting again, her eyes moist but steady. The silence returned, but it was different now, less suffocating, less lonely. It was the kind of silence that held room for healing, for stories yet to come. The days passed slowly in Margaret's cottage, each one softened by the rhythm of the forest. Mornings brought pale light through the curtains and the smell of pine drifting in from outside. Evenings ended with the fire's glow, painting the walls in amber. Yet for Elena, time felt frozen, as though the betrayal on the misty road had carved a scar that refused to close. She spoke little. Most of her words were swallowed before they reached her lips. She spent hours wrapped in the plaid blanket, staring at the fire, her small hands clenched around its edges. Margaret never forced her, never demanded conversation. She moved about the cottage with quiet purpose, chopping vegetables, mending linens, sweeping the floor, her presence steady like the low hum of a lullaby. Ranger was Elena's shadow. He rarely strayed more than a few feet away, his amber eyes following her every shift, every tremble. At night, he lay across the doorway like a sentry. In the day, he rested his head against her knee or pressed his body close to her chair. His silent devotion was the first thing that seemed to ease the storm inside her. On the third evening, the air turned colder. A hard wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the scent of rain. Margaret set another log on the fire, the sparks leaping high before settling into a steady glow. She carried 2 cups of tea to the table, placing one beside Elena. Chamomile, Margaret said softly, good for calming the heart. Elena looked down at the steaming cup, her fingers twitching, then finally curling around the handle. She lifted it slowly, taking a sip. The warmth seeped into her chest, loosening something tight within her. For a long while, they sat in silence, the fire filling the room with its steady crackle. It was Elena who broke it. Her voice was so faint, Margaret almost thought she imagined it. He left me. The words trailed into the crackle of the fire. Margaret froze. She set her cup down carefully, turning to the girl. Elena's eyes stayed fixed on the flames, her lips trembling. My father, she finished, barely louder than a breath. The words seemed to hollow the air. Margaret's chest tightened, her eyes stinging. She reached across the table, her hand covering Elena's small one. Her touch was gentle but firm, an anchor against the current of pain that had just broken free. Oh, sweetheart. Her voice cracked, despite herself. I'm so sorry. Elena's chin quivered. She squeezed the blanket tighter, her eyes shining with tears that refused to fall. He said, I was too heavy, a burden. Margaret's hand tightened over hers, not to silence her, but to tell her she wasn't alone in the saying of it. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, slipping free down her cheeks. She had heard confessions in hospital rooms, whispered in the last breaths of children and mothers alike. But this cut deeper than most. A father abandoning his child was a wound beyond comprehension. Ranger, sensing the shift, rose silently and crossed to Elena's side. He pressed his muzzle against her lap, a soft whine vibrating in his chest. His head lowered until it rested fully on her knees, his amber eyes fixed upward, steady and unyielding. Elena looked down at him, blinking furiously as tears finally spilled over. Her small hand slipped free of the blanket and sank into his fur. She clutched him, holding fast as though he alone could keep her from breaking apart. "I begged him," she whispered, voice raw. "I screamed, but he drove away." Margaret's tears fell freely now. She rose from her chair, kneeling beside the girl, her hands wrapping around Elena's trembling ones. "You didn't deserve that," she said fiercely, her voice trembling with conviction. "Not ever. Do you hear me, Elena? None of this is your fault." Elena's sobs came then, small, broken sounds that shook her shoulders. She buried her face against Ranger's head, her fingers tangled in his fur. The shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. He stayed exactly where she needed him, absorbing every tear, every tremor, like he had been born for this moment. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around Elena, pressing her cheek to the girl's temple. "He may have left you," she whispered, "but you are not alone. Not anymore." The fire crackled louder, filling the silence that followed. Elena's sobs slowed, though her grip on Ranger remained tight. Her breathing steadied in fits and starts, like waves learning how to calm after a storm. For the first time since that terrible day on the road, she had spoken the truth out loud, and though the pain of it lingered sharp and raw, it no longer lived locked inside her chest. It had been heard. It had been shared. Margaret stayed kneeling until the girl's trembling eased. Only then did she pull back enough to look into her face, brushing damp hair from her cheeks. "You're safe here," she said again, voice quiet but certain. "I swear it on everything I have left." Eleanor blinked up at her, eyes swollen, cheeks wet, but in them was something fragile and new, the faintest glimmer of trust. Ranger thumped his tail softly against the floor, a gentle rhythm that filled the room with reassurance. He kept his head on Elena's lap, eyes half closed, as if to say, "I will never leave." And for the first time, Elena let her body lean forward, resting her head against Margaret's shoulder. The old nurse's arms wrapped around her, with the ease of someone who had waited her whole life to hold this child. The silence that followed was no longer suffocating. It was healing. The night lay heavy over the cottage. Outside, the forest had gone silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Only the faint whisper of wind against the shutters and the occasional crack of the fire broke the stillness. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, half asleep, a book closed in her lap. The firelight glowed against her lined face, softening the furrows of age and care. Across from her, Eleanor curled under the plaid blanket, small form sinking deep into the armchair. Ranger rested at her feet, head heavy on his paws, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It was the kind of silence Margaret had come to cherish, the kind that allowed wounds to mend without words. But tonight, something about it felt fragile, as though the air itself knew what was about to be said. Elena shifted restlessly, her eyes half open, staring into the flames. Her lips moved once, then stilled. Margaret thought the girl was murmuring in her sleep, caught in another nightmare. But then, clear as a blade cutting through fog, the words came. "He killed my mom." Margaret's breath caught. She sat up sharply, the rocker creaking beneath her. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Elena's eyes glistened in the firelight. She wasn't dreaming. Her voice was trembling, but her words came steady, carrying a weight far too heavy for a child. "My dad. He killed her." Margaret froze, her heart pounding. She wanted to dismiss it as confusion, grief twisting memory. But the look on Elena's face stopped her. This wasn't the wild imagining of a broken child. This was belief, carved deep into her bones. "Elena," Margaret whispered carefully, leaning forward. "Why would you think that?" The girl's hands clenched the blanket. She blinked fast, as if replaying the memories in her mind, ones she had been too afraid to speak until now. "They said it was an accident, a car crash. But I heard them before." Her throat tightened, her voice breaking into sobs. "They used to fight at night when they thought I was asleep. He was angry because she didn't want to sign the papers. He wanted insurance, a big policy. He kept saying it would solve everything." Margaret felt her chest cave in. Insurance. Money. The kind of motive she had seen wreck families before, but rarely carried out to such horror. Eleanor pressed her palms to her eyes, shaking. 1 week later, she was dead. He told everyone it was a drunk driver. But he knew too much. He didn't cry, not once. Just kept saying it was fate. And now we'd be taken care of. Her words dissolved into sobs, muffled against the blanket. "I know he did it. I know it." Margaret's throat burned with tears she refused to let fall. She slid from the rocker and knelt beside the girl, gathering her trembling hands into her own. "Sweetheart, oh my poor girl." She pressed Eleanor's knuckles against her chest, as though to shield her from the truth she carried. No child should ever have to hold something like that inside. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift. With a soft whine, he pushed his muzzle against Elena's lap, forcing his warmth into her sorrow. She collapsed forward, burying her face in his fur, sobbing until her shoulders shook. The shepherd stayed unmoving, his eyes dark with quiet understanding. Margaret stroked Eleanor's hair, her voice steady, even as fear coiled in her stomach. "You're safe here. I promise you. He won't touch you. Not while I have breath in my body." But inside, her mind churned. If the girl was right, if Victor Hale had staged an accident for money, if he had murdered his wife, then this was no simple case of abandonment. This was larger, darker, more dangerous. She had dealt with grief, with pain, with families torn apart by illness. But this was a monster wearing a tailored suit. She pressed a kiss to the girl's damp forehead, forcing calm into her voice. "Rest now, child. You've carried enough for tonight." Eleanor sniffled, nodding weakly, her face still pressed into Ranger's fur. Her breathing slowed, the exhaustion of confession weighing her down. Slowly, her sobs faded, leaving only the small, hiccuping breaths of a child too tired to cry anymore. Margaret stayed kneeling until she was sure the girl's eyes had drifted shut. Only then did she rise, her knees stiff, her heart heavier than before. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the forest beyond. The night stretched endless, shadows shifting in the trees. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she remembered. Hair more silver, eyes more burdened. She whispered to herself, so softly even Ranger didn't stir. "What have you gotten us into, Victor?" Her hand tightened on the curtain. She thought of the promises she had made, to keep Eleanor safe, to shield her from harm, and she would keep them. But now, with the truth, or at least Eleanor's truth, laid bare, Margaret understood something with chilling clarity. This was bigger than the tears of one child. Bigger than a single act of cruelty. If Elena was right, they weren't just hiding from a selfish father. They were standing against a man who had already killed once, and might not hesitate to do it again. Margaret let the curtain fall and turned back to the fire, where Eleanor slept at last, her small hand tangled in Ranger's fur. The shepherd's eyes met hers, glowing faintly in the firelight, steady and sharp. It was as if he knew, as if he too sensed the storm looming on the horizon. Margaret whispered into the quiet, a vow carved into the night. "We'll protect her, no matter what it takes." Ranger's tail thumped once against the rug, as though sealing the promise. Morning crept into the cottage softly, fog thinning as pale light slipped through the curtains. The storm had passed, leaving the forest heavy with dew. Inside, the fire was down to embers. Margaret sat at the table, hands around a mug of lukewarm tea. Eleanor still slept in the armchair, curled under blankets, her small face finally at peace. Ranger sprawled at her side, muzzle close to the girl's arm, as if standing guard, even in rest. Margaret's gaze lingered. Tenderness stirred in her chest, and with it, memory. Ranger had once belonged to Daniel, her husband, a police officer with calm eyes and a steady voice. He had trained canines, trusted them with his life. And Ranger had been his finest partner. She remembered Daniel's laugh, the day he brought Ranger home. "Smartest one I've trained yet, loyal to the bone." And he was right. Ranger had found missing children, tracked suspects, stood unflinching in danger. When Daniel was killed in the line of duty, Margaret thought the house would break under the weight of silence. But Ranger stayed. Retired, grey at the muzzle now, but still the sentinel Daniel had trained. It was Ranger who had carried her through grief. And perhaps fate had placed him here again, just in time to protect Eleanor. Margaret laid another log on the embers and brushed Ranger's head. His amber eyes opened, sharp, then soft. "You always know, don't you?" she whispered. "You knew I needed you, and she needs you now." His tail thumped once, his gaze drifting back to the girl. The days settled into a fragile rhythm. Margaret tended to chores, Eleanor stared into the fire or sketched quietly, and Ranger shadowed them both with a soldier's vigilance. He patrolled the tree line, lay at the girl's feet, ears twitching at every sound. It was late afternoon when his growl first shattered the calm. He rose suddenly, eyes locked on the window, muscles taut. Margaret's breath caught as headlights flickered through the fog outside. A black car creeping down the dirt road. Wrong for these woods. Ranger pressed against the door, teeth just bared. Elena clutched her notebook. "Is it him?" she whispered. Margaret forced a steady tone. "We don't know that. Could be hunters, or someone lost." But even she didn't believe it. The car lingered too long before vanishing into the fog. Ranger stayed tense long after, body vibrating under Margaret's hand. She whispered, "Good boy, we'll be careful." That night, Eleanor struggled to sleep, flinching at every creak. But Ranger stretched across the doorway, a living barricade. When she whispered, "Are you watching me?" His amber eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. He gave a low huff and laid his head back down. Relief loosened her chest. She fell asleep with the certainty he would not let anyone through that door. Over the next few days, his vigilance never wavered. A snapped branch, a shadow on the road. Ranger was always first to rise, muscles coiled, bark sharp. Elena's small hand would instinctively find his fur, whispering, "You won't let them hurt me, will you?" He pressed into her touch, silent reassurance. Margaret saw how the bond deepened. Ranger had once protected Daniel. Now he protected this fragile girl who had known too much sorrow. One evening, Margaret told her gently, "He served with my husband. They trusted each other with their lives." Eleanor's eyes widened. "So, he's done this before?" Margaret nodded. And he hasn't forgotten how. Eleanor looked down at him, a flicker of awe softening her face. Then maybe he was sent to me. The first smile came on a morning of sunlight. Margaret wheeled Elena onto the porch, the girl's pale face tilted to the warmth. Ranger sprawled at her feet, coat gleaming. Margaret brought out an old brush. He likes this. I think he'd like it from you. Elena hesitated, but Ranger shifted, ears flicking forward in trust. She brushed clumsily at first, then smoother, tufts of fur catching the breeze like strands of gold. When she fumbled, Ranger sighed theatrically, and a tiny puff of laughter escaped Elena's lips, the first sound of amusement Margaret had heard. Encouraged, the girl brushed again. Ranger leaned into it, tail tapping, eyes closing. He rolled slightly onto his side, exposing his chest. Eleanor gasped, then reached out with trembling fingers. The shepherd groaned in contentment. And then it happened. A laugh, high and fragile, but real. She clapped a hand over her mouth, startled by the sound. Ranger nudged her hand again, and she giggled, fuller now, her face lighting with something unshadowed by fear. Margaret turned away, tears stinging her eyes. Daniel's words echoed. Sometimes it only takes one moment of light to chase back years of dark. When she returned, Elena was murmuring softly to Ranger. You knew I'd do it, didn't you? You just wanted me to try. Margaret crouched beside her. He chose you. Dogs like him don't give trust easily. But once they do, it's forever. Eleanor whispered, wide-eyed. Forever? Forever, Margaret said firmly. The girl leaned against Ranger's side, her forehead resting on his fur. He stayed still, warmth wrapping around her like a shield. And in that moment, Margaret saw it. The child within Elena, fragile but alive. Maybe he's my angel, Elena whispered. Margaret laid a hand on her shoulder. Not maybe, sweetheart. He is. That night, the cottage was quiet. Eleanor slept curled toward Ranger, her hand tangled in his fur. Margaret watched from her rocker, tears drying on her cheeks. Fate had taken much. Daniel, her peace, her certainty. But perhaps it had also given her this, a broken child, a loyal shepherd, and the chance to stand between them and the darkness. Across the room, Ranger stirred, one amber eye meeting hers. She whispered, You know, don't you? His tail thumped once. Margaret's voice was steady. Then we'll stand watch together. And in that fragile cottage, where grief and fear had lived, something new breathed at last. Vigilance, loyalty, and the first fragile threads of hope. The cottage had gone quiet for the night. Elena slept curled beneath the quilt. Ranger stretched faithfully at her side. Only the fire sighed in the hearth, and the wind whispered through the pines. Margaret sat at the table under a dim lamp, papers spread before her, legal forms, clippings, and her late husband's notes. She hadn't touched the tin box in years. Now every page trembled under her hands, more from the weight of choice than age. Her eyes drifted to Eleanor, sleeping with her hand tangled in Ranger's fur. The shepherd's body was a shield even in rest. Margaret pressed a palm to her forehead. What was she supposed to do? The law said call the sheriff, hand Eleanor over to the system. But Margaret knew the system. Too often, children's voices were ignored, their truths dismissed. And here, the truth was dangerous. Victor Hale, wealthy, influential. If Eleanor was right, if he had abandoned her, If he had murdered his wife, he would not hesitate to silence her. With his lawyers and money, he would paint her as unstable before she ever had a chance to speak. Margaret's hand froze on a faded document. Guardianship rights. Daniel had once used these forms to help a fellow officer fight for custody of his niece. She remembered his steady voice. Children are the most vulnerable witnesses. The system doesn't always protect them. Sometimes it fails. Margaret shut her eyes, her throat tight. You knew, didn't you, Daniel? She looked again at Elena, her small face softened by sleep, lips curved faintly from the laughter she had shared, brushing Ranger's fur. Margaret whispered into the quiet, I can't let him have you. Not ever. Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes glowing in the lamplight. He padded into the kitchen and rested his chin on her lap. His weight steadied her. Margaret stroked his fur, voice breaking. If I hide her, I break the law. If I give her up, he breaks her spirit. Either way. Her tears slipped silently. Ranger whined softly, pressing closer. Margaret drew a breath. You're right. Think like Daniel. Evidence, procedure, protection. She gathered the papers into a battered folder. Guardianship forms, notes, contacts. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. She glanced at Eleanor and swore under her breath. Whatever it takes, child. I won't let him win. Mist hung heavy the next morning as Margaret wheeled Eleanor down the forest path. Ranger trotted ahead, nose low, ears sharp. Halfway to the road, he froze. His head snapped up, fur bristling. A growl rumbled in his chest. Margaret's grip tightened on the chair handles. What is it, boy? Ignoring her, Ranger nosed the ground, then veered toward the road. Elena's small hand clutched the armrest. He smells something. The dirt road appeared through fog, a scar across the forest. Ranger stopped at a bend and pawed the ground. Margaret crouched, and her breath caught. Tire tracks, deep and fresh. Not local, too wide, too clean. City tires. Ranger barked once, then nosed at a pile of leaves. Margaret brushed them aside and froze. A black wallet, damp but intact. Her fingers shook as she opened it. A license started back. Victor Hale. Elena gasped. It's his. Margaret turned the wallet over. Folded papers slipped free. Financial records, transfers, a life insurance policy. The ink was smudged, but clear enough. Proof. Her knees buckled, and she sat hard against the earth. He really had done it. He had killed for money. Ranger stood stiff, scanning the trees. Elena's fists clenched in her lap. He was here, she whispered. He came looking. Margaret stuffed the papers back into the wallet, clutching it to her chest. This was evidence, but also danger. If Victor had been this close, he knew where to search. The fog felt less like mist and more like a net closing in. Come on, Margaret said tightly. We have to get back. Ranger led them home, circling, barking once whenever the forest shifted. By the time they reached the porch, Margaret's hands shook from more than strain. Inside, she locked the door and spread the documents on the table. Ink blotted, edges damp, but still legible. Greed, insurance, betrayal. She whispered to the shepherd still guarding the door. You found it, boy. You found what no one else would. Elena's eyes shone with fragile hope. Maybe now they'll believe me. Margaret squeezed her hand. They will. This is just the beginning. That night, the wallet sat on the table like a weapon, Elena slept in the armchair. Ranger sprawled across the threshold, tense even in rest. Margaret stared at the landline on the wall. Her hand hovered, trembling. To call was to risk everything. To stay silent was to betray the child. She reached. The receiver clicked, loud in the quiet. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Sheriff Daniels. "Daniels," came the gruff voice. Her throat tightened. "It's Margaret Collins." Silence, then a softer tone. "Maggie. Been a long time." "Yes," she whispered. "Too long." She steadied herself. "I wouldn't call unless it was serious." "I figured," he said. "What's happened?" Margaret glanced at Elena. Her voice dropped. "I have a child here, abandoned by her father. I believe her mother's death wasn't an accident. I found documents, insurance, transfers, enough to raise suspicion." The sheriff was silent for a long moment, papers rustling faintly on his end. "What's her name?" "Elena Hale." A sharp breath. "Hale, as in Victor Hale?" "Yes." The silence grew heavier. Finally, Daniel said, "Margaret, be careful. That man has long arms. Lawyers, politicians. If you move too fast, he'll bury you. And her." Margaret's grip whitened on the receiver. "So I do nothing?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "You did right by calling. But we have to be smart, quiet. I'll start a discreet investigation. But until then, keep her safe. Don't trust anyone you don't have to." Margaret's eyes burned. She looked at Elena's sleeping face. "She's been through enough. I won't let him touch her again. Not while I live." Daniels exhaled, his voice low with respect. "I know you won't. I'll send someone I trust to check the road. But if Victor learns she's alive, he'll come hard. Be ready." Margaret's gaze shifted to Ranger. His amber eyes were fixed on her, as if he understood every word. She whispered, more to him than the sheriff, "We're ready." Daniels paused. "Protect that child like she's your own." Margaret's voice cracked, but stayed firm. "She is. At least until the law says otherwise." "God help you both," he murmured. Then the line went dead. Margaret set the receiver down, her hands shaking. Fear pressed close, but beneath it, determination burned brighter. She crossed to Elena, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You're not alone anymore, child, and I won't let him take you back." Ranger padded over, pressing his head against her shoulder. Margaret leaned into him, whispering, "It begins now, old boy. Quiet steps, careful moves, but we'll bring him down." Outside, the forest swirled with mist, dark and watchful. But inside, in the glow of the dying fire, a fragile alliance had formed. Margaret had made the call. The wheels were turning. And though Victor Hale's shadow was long, she was no longer standing against it alone. The city never slept. Neon lights spilled across glass towers, traffic humming like veins through concrete. On the 37th floor, Victor Hale stood with a glass of scotch, his reflection sharp against the skyline. Earlier that day, a call had rattled him, a contractor whispering that a girl matching Elena's description had been seen near the county line, with a dog and an old woman. Victor's grip had nearly cracked the glass. He had buried that chapter, bought silence with money, smoothed suspicion with charm. If Elena was alive, everything he'd built, the fortune, the respectability, was at risk. He pressed his intercom. "Get Carmichael and Calloway." Minutes later, the lawyer and the fixer stood before him. Carmichael, slick and calculating, already flipping open a briefcase. Calloway, broad-shouldered, radiating threat. "My daughter," Victor said smoothly. "The one the world believes was tragically lost. She may have resurfaced." Carmichael's brow twitched. "That would complicate insurance payouts. The merger. Everything," Victor snapped. He dropped a folder of Elena's old photos on the desk. "If she's alive, I want to know where. Who has her? How much she remembers." Calloway asked bluntly, "Do you want her brought back?" Victor's smile was thin, humorless. "I want her silenced. Permanently, if necessary. But no scandal." The city hummed beyond the glass as Carmichael recovered his composure. "If she surfaces officially, we'll counter. Paint her as unstable, traumatized. I'll prepare medical records, statements. The press will lap it up." Victor nodded. "Do it. And remind the insurance company I've been supporting her care privately." He turned to Calloway, eyes like knives. "Find her. Find who's helping. Silence anyone she's spoken to. No trails." The fixer gathered the photos without a word. The lawyer jotted notes, already drafting lies. Victor returned to the window, his image gleaming over the city he owned. "Elena," he murmured. "You should have stayed gone." While Victor plotted, a different kind of work began miles away. At the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office, files spread across a cluttered table. Detective Carla Mendez leaned over the evidence bag, holding Victor's wallet, its damp contents drying under a lamp. Sheriff Daniels sat across from her, jaw set. "Financial records don't lie," Carla said. "He doubled the insurance policy 6 months before her death. Transfers line up with the accident." Daniels nodded grimly. "Motives there. But we need more than numbers, something that ties his hand to the crime." So they started quietly, tracing the past. Carla visited a diner where Victor's former housekeeper worked. The woman's hands shook as she poured coffee. "We heard fights, screaming. Mrs. Hale begged him to stop gambling, to stop wasting everything. He hated her for it. And the night she died, he told us not to call anyone. Said it was handled." "That's when I quit." Daniels tracked down a neighbor from Victor's old gated community, a widower with a sharp memory. "She came to my door one night," he said, pouring bourbon, "sat crying in my living room. Next morning she went back, said she had no choice. She was afraid of him. When she died, I told myself it was fate, but I never believed it." Piece by piece, the portrait formed. Not a grieving husband, but a predator who built his empire on silence. In insurance records, Carla found more. A memo from an investigator at the time. Unusual increase in coverage, but claim processed at executive request. She circled the words. Another bribe. Another door forced open with money. Suspicion hardened into evidence. Still, Daniels kept the work quiet. "If Victor smells this too soon," he warned, "he'll sweep it clean." Carla nodded. "But the truth's moving now. We just have to move faster than he does." Back in the forest, the storm came to Margaret's door. Night pressed heavy on the cottage, fog curling through the pines. Margaret sat at the table, papers spread before her, fatigue in her bones. Eleanor had gone to bed hours earlier. Ranger lay at the threshold, chest rising slow. Then his body stiffened. His head snapped up, ears sharp, a growl vibrating through the floorboards. Margaret froze. "What is it, boy?" A faint glow cut through the fog. Headlights, creeping too slowly for a passerby. Her heart lurched. She hurried to Eleanor's room, waking the girl gently. "Sweetheart, come with me. Quiet now." Eleanor stirred, frightened, but obeyed. Margaret guided her to the kitchen, pulled back the rug, and opened the trap door to the cellar. The air smelled of cedar and earth. "Stay here," she whispered, crouching to meet the child's terrified eyes. "No matter what you hear." Elena clutched her hand. "Is it him?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Maybe his men. But you're safe." "Ranger and I won't let anything happen." The shepherd planted himself halfway down the cellar ramp, body rigid, growl steady. Margaret closed the trapdoor above him, leaving only a sliver of air. Then she doused the lamp. Outside, the headlights cut out. Silence. Margaret crept to the window, pulling the curtain back a fraction. Two shadows moved through the mist, one circling to the porch, the other toward the back. The porch creaked. A hand rattled the doorknob. Ranger exploded in a roar, not a pet's bark, but the command of a trained K9. The sound shook the walls, guttural and lethal. The men froze. Muffled voices hissed. "Big dog. Police trained. Not worth it." Their footsteps retreated. Headlights flared, then disappeared into fog. Margaret sagged against the wall, breath racing. Only when Ranger's growl eased did she lift the trapdoor. Elena stared up, pale and trembling. "Are they gone?" "For now," Margaret said, pulling her close. Ranger prowled the room, sniffing every shadow before planting himself at the door again, chest still heaving. His amber eyes burned in the dark. Margaret lowered herself into a chair, hands shaking. She looked from the child to the shepherd and felt the truth pressed down like stone. Victor knew. He was circling, and he would not stop until he had her back. Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth, whispering into the silence. "God help us. This is only the beginning." The cottage lay in silence, thick with the kind that follows fear. The echo of headlights on the road and the rattle at the door still hung in the air. Margaret sat by the dying hearth, unwilling to let the lamp burn. Outside, an owl called low and lonely. In the bedroom, Elena tossed beneath her quilt, whispering broken words as her small hands clutched the blanket. Ranger lay at her bedside, ears flicking at every sound, eyes fixed on her. Then the nightmare took her. She was back in the car that night. Rain on the windshield, her wheelchair folded beside her. Her mother's laughter filled the dark until headlights cut across the lane. A scream, metal shrieking, glass exploding into stars. Then silence. Eleanor cried out, "Mama!" But the darkness answered only with emptiness. Her body jolted awake. The fire had gone cold. Gasping, she reached for Ranger, burying her face in his fur as sobs shook her thin frame. The dog pressed closer, his warmth pulling her back. Margaret appeared in the doorway, moving quickly, her years as a nurse in every gesture. She gathered the trembling child into her arms. "Shh, sweetheart. You're safe." It was her, Eleanor whispered. "The headlights." She screamed. "I saw it." Margaret's heart twisted. It was only a dream, but Elena's eyes were wide, haunted. "No, it happened. I remember now. The crash, the way he—" She broke off, choking. Margaret cupped her face. "You are not there anymore. You are here, with me, with Ranger, and we will not let anyone abandon you again." The girl collapsed into her chest, sobbing, while Ranger circled and lay across Margaret's feet like a shield. The three stayed like that, bound together in grief and fragile hope. When the storm passed and Elena's sobs faded, Margaret pulled the quilt higher. "You are stronger than you think," she whispered, "because you survived. And because your mother's love is still here, in you. Eleanor sniffled. Do you really think so? I know so. The girl stroked Ranger's ears, a fragile smile flickering. Maybe she's still here, in me, in you, in Ranger. Margaret's throat tightened. You are never truly alone. Before sleep claimed her again, Elena whispered, Promise you won't let him take me back. Margaret's grip was fierce. I promise. But when dawn came, Margaret knew the fight was only beginning. Sunlight fought weakly through the fog as Margaret washed a cup that didn't need cleaning. Ranger's sharp bark shattered the silence. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up the dirt path, bringing both relief and dread. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his hat low, his eyes kind but wary. Maggie, he said softly. Margaret forced a steady voice. Sheriff. Ranger stood between them, sniffed, then retreated to Eleanor's side. The girl lingered in the hall, clutching the wall, her eyes flicking between the stranger and Margaret. Daniels removed his hat. You must be Elena. She nodded faintly. Ranger pressed against her, grounding her. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. The sheriff is here to help. Remember what we said, telling the truth so they'll believe you. Elena drew a shaky breath, rolled forward and whispered, I'll try. They gathered at the small kitchen table. Daniels set a recorder down. This isn't a court, sweetheart, just us. Stop any time. All I need is your truth. Eleanor's grip on Ranger's fur tightened. Her words came fragile but certain. He said it was a scenic stop. Then he pushed my chair into the road. He said I was too heavy, a burden. And then he left me. The fog closed in. I thought I would die there. Margaret's eyes burned, but she let the child speak. Daniels leaned closer. You're very brave. Do you remember anything else about your mother? Eleanor hesitated, then whispered, He killed her. He staged the accident. He wanted the money. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Why do you believe that? Because he told me once. Not directly. But he said if she hadn't died, none of the money or this life would have been possible. I didn't understand then. I do now. Daniels closed his notebook, the recorder still running. Your testimony matters. Combined with what we're finding, it will make a difference. Margaret squeezed Elena's hand. See? They're listening now. But Daniel's face hardened. Victor Hale isn't just a man. He's a machine of money and fear. He will fight. He will twist this. He won't stop. Then neither will we, Margaret said. Eleanor wiped her tears, fire sparking in her eyes. I'm not afraid anymore. Not if I have you. Not if I have a Ranger. The dog pressed his head into her lap, sealing the vow. Daniels rose at last, tipping his hat. The law hasn't forgotten the innocent. Not while I'm breathing. When his cruiser disappeared, Margaret turned to Eleanor. You told your truth. That took more courage than most men will ever know. Maybe now someone will believe me, Eleanor whispered. They already do. And for the first time, hope felt possible. That evening, the television flickered with muted colors but sharp cruelty. Victor Hale's face filled the screen. Perfect suit, perfect hair, voice breaking on cue. My Elena, he said, hand to chest. She is sick, fragile, unstable. I beg anyone with information, help bring her home. Asked about his wife's death, he shook his head sorrowfully. Cruel lies. Her death was a tragedy. Elena isn't well. She needs her father. Images of Eleanor flashed behind him. School portraits, smiling, innocent. To the world, Victor was the grieving father, the hero. Margaret's fists clenched. That snake. She nearly threw the remote as his voice filled the room. Eleanor sat frozen, trembling. As his words unspooled like poison, she whispered, "He's coming for me. He'll find me." Ranger pressed against her, nudging her hand until her fingers tangled in his fur. Still, her tears fell. Margaret knelt, gripping her hands. He can play saint for the cameras, but we know the truth. The sheriff knows it. That's what matters. But everyone believes him, Elena sobbed. They'll take me back. I'll be trapped again. Margaret's voice was fierce. No one is taking you back. Not while I'm breathing. Not while Ranger's on guard. The shepherd barked once, sharp and certain. He's rich, Margaret said. He's powerful. But he doesn't have what we do. Truth. And love. Elena leaned into her, tears soaking her shoulder. Margaret smoothed her hair. You gave your statement. That's the first step. In court, facts matter. We'll fight harder if we must. That's what your mama would want. For you to stand tall. Eleanor nodded faintly. Margaret shut the television off, letting silence reclaim the cottage. Outside, Victor commanded cameras and lies. Inside, there was only a weary woman, a fragile child, and a dog with a growl strong enough to guard them all. Margaret knew the truth with bone-deep clarity. Victor had declared war, and she would fight him to her last breath. The first sign was the layered hum of engines on the distant road. Margaret stood at the sink, hands still soapy, listening. Not a lone pickup. Not the measured growl of the sheriff's cruiser. A swarm, multiple vehicles grinding up the gravel, doors slamming, voices rising. Her stomach tightened. She lifted the curtain a fraction. Tripods, boom mics. Microphones flashing logos she recognized, and many she didn't. Local, then state, then national. A tide of strangers with hungry eyes spilling over the dirt path like scavengers after a storm. Ranger was already at the door, hackles up, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Elena rolled into the living room, eyes wide. They found us, she whispered. Not found, Margaret said, kneeling in front of her. Sniffing. There's a difference. Stay with Ranger. I'll handle it. Outside, questions struck like buckshot. Mrs. Collins, is the girl with you Victor Hale's daughter? Is she safe? Is Victor lying about her condition? This is private property, Margaret snapped, raising a hand. Back up. Privacy meant nothing out here. A cameraman stepped closer, lens fixed on the house. A curtain shifted, Eleanor's pale face flashed in the window for a heartbeat. It was enough. The crowd rippled. There she is, someone shouted. Microphones lunged forward like weapons. Margaret moved to block their view. She's a child, she said, firm and cold. Not your story. A photographer crouched on the porch edge and clicked at the exact second. Ranger leapt between Elena and the window. Teeth bared, but silent. Vest worn and faded, yet the letters were clear. Police K9. Amber eyes locked on the camera, protective, defiant. By evening, the image was everywhere. The phone rang. An old friend from town, breathless. Maggie, turn on the TV. They're calling him a hero. Margaret hesitated, then switched on the set. The photograph filled the screen. Anchors spoke in solemn tones. A mysterious girl, believed to be Victor Hale's daughter, is seen with a retired nurse and a former police K9. One image has captured the nation's heart. The dog standing guard, shielding the frightened child. The crawl at the bottom flooded with hashtags. #GuardianDog, #ProtectElena, #truth will out. Elena trembled, watching. Now he knows for sure, she whispered. He'll come. Margaret shut off the television and knelt. Listen to me. This isn't his stage anymore. The country saw Ranger protecting you. That picture did what all his money couldn't. It showed the truth. Ranger placed his head on Elena's lap. Her breathing slowed as she stroked his fur. Outside, the press lingered at the drive's end, wolves circling firelight. Night fell before they dispersed. The phone rang again. Sheriff Daniels, steady but urgent. The tide's turning. People are questioning Victor's story. But attention cuts both ways. He's furious. He'll push harder. From now on, you're watched. Margaret looked at Eleanor curled against Ranger, the child who had been abandoned and was now finally being seen. She tightened her grip on the receiver. Then let them watch, she said. The truth's coming out whether Victor likes it or not. Across the country, the photo shifted the story. Victor's polished pleas looked thinner next to an image no PR firm could spin. Strangers debated his sincerity. Whispers of cruelty outweighed his charm. For the first time, the tide leaned against him. Inside the courthouse, prosecutors worked under fluorescent glare. Stacks of financial records, insurance forms, and sworn statements grew taller. Detective Carla Mendez pinned pages to the evidence board. Patterns, she muttered. Policies and transfers, always just before a tragedy. His wife wasn't the first, just the most convenient. Her partner slid a glossy photo across the table. Victor at a gala, hand on Elena's small shoulder, smile flawless. Now he's selling grieving father. Makes my stomach turn. Sheriff Daniels joined them, jaw tight. The photo gave us cover, he said. People want answers. That buys time. But his lawyers will fight like hell. At dawn, Margaret and Elena moved. Daniels drove an unmarked SUV, the back jammed with hastily packed bags. Margaret sat stiffly in the passenger seat, eyes on the mirror. Eleanor rode in back beside Ranger, her small hand knotted in his fur as trees blurred past. "We're leaving the cottage," she whispered. "For now," Margaret said, turning. "Somewhere safer. No sneaking up." The cottage had been a fragile sanctuary. Soup and firelight and whispered promises. Leaving felt like tearing a page from their story, but safety mattered more than sentiment. Protective custody was a low, nondescript safe house near town's edge, barred windows, guards at the gate. To Elena, it looked like a polite prison. Ranger's presence dulled the edges. Within days, prosecutors filed a motion, recognized Ranger as a witness support animal. Not just a title, permission for him to sit beside Elena in court, a living symbol of safety and truth. The judge reviewed the viral photo, Daniel's affidavit of Ranger's canine training, and granted the request. When Margaret told her, Eleanor blinked. "So he's official again?" "Official and more," Margaret said, smiling. "He's your dog now, your shield." Ranger barked once, sharp and certain. Elena laughed, a sound rare enough to sting Margaret's eyes. She hugged his thick neck. "You'll sit with me. You won't let them scare me, right?" The shepherd thumped his tail. Days blurred into strategy sessions. Sterile rooms, hard chairs, the legal machine grinding forward. Margaret signed affidavits, reread transcripts, told her story again and again. Every instinct said, shield the child from all of it. The only way through was through. Eleanor practiced, too. Facing Daniels across a table, she rehearsed her truth. Her voice shook, steadied, shook, then steadied again. Ranger never left her side. At first, he rested his head in her lap. Later, when she faltered, "He left me," He said I was a burden. He pressed closer, warmth pulling her voice across the gap. You see, Daniels told the prosecutors, that dog isn't just comfort. He's proof. Proof she isn't alone. The attorneys nodded, pens scratching. Margaret said nothing, knowing the law could never quite measure what Ranger held together. At night, nightmares still came. Headlights, fog, her father's voice. Ranger moved before Margaret woke, nudging Eleanor from the brink, holding the dark at bay. Margaret gathered the child in, whispering, "It's all right, darling. It's all right." "I can do it," Elena would whisper back, "if you're with me." Margaret understood then, this was more than trial prep. It was a war, not only against Victor's lies, but against the shadows he'd left in Elena's heart. Ranger, steady and unshakable, was leading the charge. The courtroom was hushed, tension humming beneath the silence. Sunlight striped the polished wood. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras were barred, but pens hovered, hungry. At the front, Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, dwarfed by the witness stand. Margaret stayed nearby, hands clenched. Ranger stretched along the floor beside Elena, vest brushed clean, the faded police canine still read true. He pressed against the stand, a wordless reminder that the girl was not alone. The judge leaned forward, eyes soft. "Elena Hale," he said gently, "do you understand you're here to tell the truth?" "Yes, Your Honor." The words trembled. The prosecutor rose, voice careful. "Elena, can you tell the court, your own words, what happened the day your father left you?" Silence gathered. Elena's lips parted, then stilled. She glanced down. Ranger's gaze met hers, golden, unafraid. He gave the smallest whine. Her hand found his fur. "He said it was a drive," she began, fragile but clear, "through the forest. Then he stopped and pushed my chair out. He said I was too heavy, a burden. That's the word he used." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor waited. "I begged him," she whispered. "I screamed until I had no voice. He walked away. He didn't look back." He got in his car and drove into the fog. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Even the judge blinked, grief passing like a shadow. The prosecutor's voice softened further. "And your mother?" The room held its breath. Eleanor's fingers tightened in Ranger's fur until her knuckles blanched. The dog pressed closer, a living rampart. "She didn't die in an accident," Eleanor said, first a whisper, then steady. "She didn't. He killed her." The words rang, startling in their clarity. "I heard him once," she continued. "I was supposed to be asleep. He said if she hadn't died, none of this would be possible. The money, the life. He staged it. The car, the crash. And when I asked questions, when I got sick, I became inconvenient." A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't look away. At the defense table, Victor's jaw tightened. His lawyers scribbled, but ink couldn't erase what the room had heard. "Why did you choose to speak today?" the prosecutor asked. Elena looked at Margaret, then at Ranger. She stroked his head, and though her voice broke, it held, "Because no child should be thrown away. No one should lose their mother for money. I don't want him to hurt anyone else." Silence followed, thick as the air before a storm broke. Then Ranger stood. He rose slowly, placed both paws on the edge of the witness stand, and towered over Elena. Not a threat. A vow. His gaze met the judge's, unblinking. "I won't leave her," his stance said. "Not here. Not ever." A murmur washed the gallery. The judge's features softened. A juror wiped her eyes. Another laced his fingers, as if in prayer. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense rose, but the room had already decided what mattered. A frightened child speaking clean truth, and a dog refusing to move. Every objection sounded hollow against the living evidence at the stand. When the judge finally dismissed her, Margaret hurried forward. Elena folded into her arms, trembling, but not broken. Ranger pressed into both of them, tail sweeping the floor, chest heaving as if he'd carried her words on his back. In a chamber built to sift lies from truth, one thing blazed undeniable. The abandoned child was no longer voiceless. She had spoken, and the world had listened. The courthouse was packed, silence pressing against the polished benches as Victor Hale entered. His suit was immaculate, his smile practiced, the kind of presence that bent attention toward him. Reporters scribbled, jurors watched. Even in chains of accusation, he radiated control. Margaret felt a chill from the gallery. She squeezed Elena's hand, sensing the girl's unease. At their feet, Ranger lay taut and alert, every twitch of his ears echoing the tension in the room. The judge's voice cut through. "Victor Hale, you stand accused of conspiracy, insurance fraud, and the murder of your wife, Catherine Hale." "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Victor replied smoothly, his voice wrapped in grief and dignity. The murmurs that followed told Margaret all she needed. His charisma was working, planting doubt where facts should reign. The prosecutor rose, voice steady. "Your wife's death was ruled an accident, but documents, witnesses, even your daughter's testimony suggest otherwise. Can you explain the discrepancies?" Victor leaned back, expression sorrowful. "Accidents happen. My daughter is imaginative. Others interpret fear as fact." Some jurors nodded, some frowned. His charm was a weapon, subtle and dangerous. But Margaret noticed the cracks, a too tight smile, a stutter when pressed. The prosecutor laid out evidence, financial statements, emails, staged repairs, insurance fraud. Victor's eyes flickered, irritation breaking through the mask. He tugged at his tie, a nervous gesture he couldn't disguise. The question came like a scalpel. "Your daughter says she overheard you planning the accident. What do you say to that?" Victor faltered, inhaling sharply. "Children misinterpret. She is frightened, confused." Ranger growled low, ears forward. Margaret's pulse quickened. The dog knew. The courtroom felt the shift. A lie had just touched the air. The prosecutor pressed harder, pointing to fingerprints, forged documents, and neighbors' accounts. Victor's composure thinned. His jaw tightened. He tried to sound persecuted, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. For the first time, the jury scribbled with intent. When court recessed, Margaret whispered to Elena, "You did it. You told the truth." Elena exhaled, Ranger nudging her hand, silent reassurance that courage had allies. The next day, tension returned heavier. The prosecutor carried a leather briefcase to the evidence table. Victor glanced at it. A crack of unease. Ranger stiffened, hackles lifting, a growl humming in his chest. Margaret froze. She had learned to trust that sound. The prosecutor laid out folders, insurance forms, forged signatures, altered repair records. Ranger growled louder, eyes fixed on Victor's lawyer. The gallery hushed, jurors leaning forward. Victor objected smoothly, calling the dog's reaction prejudicial. But when Ranger barked sharply, the sound echoed like a verdict of its own. The judge let the moment stand, noting it for the record. The documents, presented one by one, shredded Victor's narrative. They revealed not an accident, but premeditation. A man staging tragedy for profit. Victor's mask cracked wider when the prosecutor produced statements linking him directly to false claims. He leaned forward in protest, but Ranger stepped subtly between him and Elena, silent and immovable. The dog's presence filled the room with authority no jury could ignore. The gallery gasped, the jury scribbled, even Victor's lawyer faltered. The tide was shifting, not with theatrics, but with facts, loyalty, and the uncanny instincts of a dog who refused to let deceit pass unchallenged. Then came the moment no one expected. Elena rose. Braces clicked against the floor. Ranger pressed close to her side. She was small, fragile, but every step forward radiated strength. Margaret's breath caught. This was no longer the trembling girl she had once protected. This was someone reclaiming her voice. Victor studied her with disbelief, irritation, fear. His charisma faltered against the clarity of her gaze. The jury leaned in, the gallery hushed. Her voice trembled, then steadied. You left me to die, but I lived, and I will never be your burden again. The words struck like a blade. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Ranger pressed his paw against her leg, his growl a low drum of truth. For the first time, Victor paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No script could answer this. Margaret rose behind Elena, whispering, You're safe. You're never alone. Elena glanced back, drew strength, then looked forward again. The prosecutor, watching, let a faint smile escape. No evidence could equal the raw weight of this testimony. You tried to hide the truth, Elena continued, her voice stronger. You said I was unstable, lost. But I am here, I am alive, and nothing you do can take that away. The jury shifted, some blinking back tears. Victor's jaw clenched, but his control was gone. His empire of lies collapsed under the courage of a child who would not break. Margaret touched Eleanor's hair gently. This is your moment. Eleanor nodded, Ranger pressing close, his head against her hip, silent witness to her strength. Her final words rang clear. I am not your pawn. I am not your secret. I am my own, and I will live free of your lies. The room seemed to hold its breath. The jury leaned forward, the gallery frozen in awe. Victor shrank in his seat, stripped of his mask, and for the first time, Eleanor stood taller than him. A girl who had survived betrayal and declared with unwavering truth that she would never again be silenced. Ranger's eyes never left Victor, ears forward, body steady. Protector, witness, revealer. A symbol that truth had not just evidence, but loyalty, courage, and a voice that could never again be erased. The courtroom was silent, tension pressing against every shoulder and echoing in every heartbeat. Months of testimony and painstaking investigation had led to this moment. The jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. Margaret's hands gripped the chair, her eyes fixed on Elena. Upright, steady, braces clicking softly as she shifted. Ranger lay at her side, perfectly still, gaze unblinking, alert to every breath and rustle. Judge Pearson rose, the gavel catching a blade of light from the high windows. Across the aisle, Victor Hale looked polished and brittle all at once, charisma stretched into a thin veneer of control. The jury, the judge said, voice even, has reached a verdict. He read the charges one by one, each word landing with the weight of months that could not be taken back. On fraud, attempted murder, and child endangerment. Margaret's pulse stuttered. Elena's fingers brushed Ranger's fur. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, simply anchored her. The jury finds the defendant, Victor Hale, guilty on all counts. A collective exhale rolled through the room. Relief sharpened by disbelief. Pens scratched in the gallery, hands went to mouths, a few shoulders slumped. Margaret blinked away tears. She would not break the gravity of the moment. At the defense table, Victor paled, realization creeping over his face like frost. His lawyers leaned in, whispers urgent and useless. It was too late. The truth had outrun everything else. Money, influence, charm, and none of it could erase what Eleanor had helped reveal. "It's over, isn't it?" Eleanor whispered. "It's over," Margaret said, steady, a hand sweeping a curl from the girl's forehead. "You're safe now, for good." Ranger nudged Eleanor's leg, the warm weight of his muzzle a quiet oath. He had been more than a companion. He had been a witness, steady in the nights of fear, and in the stark light of court. His eyes held something like recognition. Danger had passed, but the bond would remain. Outside, cameras flared like heat lightning. They wanted the image that had traveled the country. A small girl with metal on her legs, a woman who had become her family, and a German shepherd who never wavered. Margaret lifted a hand to shield Elena, then let it fall, allowing one clear photo. Not spectacle, testimony. Ranger's ears flicked. He stood square, the dog who had guarded truth. The rest unfolded in the deliberate rhythm of bureaucracy. Papers stamped, signatures inked, orders issued, guardianship formalized, protections codified. The weight that had once felt like a machine designed to crush now felt like armor. Clause by clause, signature by signature, a fortress took shape around Elena's life. Margaret tucked the packet to her chest and looked down at the girl. "This is ours," she said. "No one can take you from me. No one can erase what we've built." "I believe you," Eleanor said, tears bright, voice small and sure. "I've never felt so safe." Ranger pressed closer, warmth and breath, and a heartbeat against their legs. He had led them through shadows and kept vigil when the world was loud with danger. Now he allowed himself a moment of stillness. The mountain they had climbed was behind them. Victor was led away in handcuffs, protests fading to a hum. Accounts frozen, licenses revoked, investigations unspooling through the network he'd constructed. Where he once towered, he now dwindled. Another cautionary tale about power built on fear. Margaret watched him go, jaw set, then turned back to the only face that mattered. Eleanor had prevailed not through strength of force, but through truth and the unblinking loyalty that refused to abandon her. That night, in their quiet safe house, the legal packet lay on the table like a new map. Eleanor leaned into Margaret's side, the sigh that left her body carrying months of dread and sleeplessness. Margaret smoothed the girl's hair, cataloguing, without judgment or regret, every risk that had brought them here. "We did it," she whispered. "No more hiding, no more running." "I didn't think I'd ever feel free," Elena said. "But I do, because of you and Ranger." At his name, Ranger lifted his head, eyes meeting Elena's. He rested his muzzle on her lap, in a gesture both ordinary and sacred. "I am here. I will remain." Morning came soft and ordinary, and that itself felt miraculous. Light spilled into a cottage that had once been a way station and now felt like home. The clatter of mugs, the curl of steam from cocoa, the soft nudge of a dog's head against a knee, small proofs that the world could be gentle. Elena practiced walking in the kitchen. 2 careful steps, then 3, steadying herself with the table, then with Margaret's hand, then with her own breath. Each wobble earned encouragement, rather than alarm. Ranger matched her pace like a metronome for courage, pausing when she paused, moving when she moved. When she managed a longer stretch, he bumped her wrist with his nose and she laughed, light, surprised, unafraid. "Look at you," Margaret said from the doorway, pride thickening her voice. "One step at a time." Outside, the garden soil warmed under their knees. They planted flowers one by one, Ranger circling with quiet industry, alert to threats that no longer came and content for once to find none. Margaret wiped sweat from her brow and took in the sight of Elena, hair pulled back, hands dirty with new life. "You're making this place beautiful," she said. "We're making it," Elena corrected. Ranger offered a single, approving bark, as if punctuating the sentence. It was not just protection anymore, it was a partnership. Evenings reshaped themselves. Margaret read aloud from paperbacks, the sound of her voice stitching stories through the cottage rooms. Sometimes shadows stirred, a noise too loud, a memory too sharp, but they did not overrun the space. Ranger redirected them by simply being there, head on Eleanor's knee, steady as a lighthouse lamp. At dusk on a gold-washed day, Eleanor took the garden path, braces bright in the light, steps sure and earned. Margaret walked a breath behind, hands open and ready, but not overbearing. Ranger went stride for stride, glancing up as if to remind her that strength isn't loud, it's consistent. "You're doing it," Margaret said, tears unashamed in her eyes. "Every step is yours." "I couldn't do it without you, or him," Eleanor answered, tipping her chin toward Ranger. He cocked his head and wagged, reading the room like always. Margaret knelt and pulled them both close, and for the first time, the past felt like a place they had left, not a shadow clinging to their shoes. Night after night, Ranger slept at the foot of Elena's bed, a warm weight at the edge of dreams. Sometimes he shifted to rest his head over her blanket, a silent promise renewed. Margaret would sit in the doorway for a while, the hush punctuated by wind and soft canine breaths, and marvel at the ordinary grace of safety. Days became weeks, and the cottage filled with laughter. Meals stretched into conversations. The clatter of fear gradually receded, replaced by the lighter music of belonging. Ranger moved through the rooms like an invisible thread, binding the home together, not by duty now, but by choice. One afternoon, Margaret set up a simple obstacle course in the grass. Cones, a narrow board, a loop back to the porch. Elena navigated it with a focus that had once been reserved for survival. Ranger trotted ahead, pausing at turns as if to say, "Here, now here." Elena laughed, clear and full. Margaret watched, chest tight with the kind of gratitude that has no words. This, she thought, is the victory. Not the headline or the verdict, but the return of ordinary life. At sunset on the porch, with the light going soft and birds turning down the day, they sat, girl, woman, dog. Elena leaned into Margaret. Ranger's head rested in her lap. It was the sound of a small family finding its rhythm. "We're a family now," Margaret said into the cooling air. "Nothing can take this." Eleanor nodded, lids heavy, mouth curved in a quiet smile. Ranger sighed, that deep, contented release that meant the perimeter was secure. Courage, justice, love. Still standing, still intertwined. The sun rose on a different morning years later, throwing long gold bars across a freshly painted sign. The Ranger Trust. Healing through courage and loyalty. Laughter threaded the air, children's voices mixing with the friendly panting of retired canines. Paws tapped on paths. Volunteers adjusted leashes, explained boundaries, modeled gentleness. Margaret stood at the threshold, clipboard in one hand, the other on Ranger's back. He was older now, grey haloing his muzzle, but the posture was the same, the vigilance untarnished. Eleanor moved beside him with deliberate grace, braces present but less intrusive, gait balanced by will and hard-won muscle. She had grown into a young woman who saw clearly in both directions, the years behind that taught her what breaks a life, and the years ahead where care could rebuild others. Her eyes scanned the grounds. A boy hesitated before a German shepherd, and then, at the handler's nod, reached out. The dog's ears dipped in a practiced hello. "It's ready," Margaret murmured. Awe threaded her voice. "All of it. Everything we dreamed." Elena laid a hand on Ranger's ribs, feeling the steady rise and fall. "We couldn't have done it without him," she said, not as sentiment but as traceable fact. Ranger exhaled and followed her gaze toward the children, a small, cross-legged girl who'd stopped speaking after a fire, a teen who jumped at door slams, a boy with a quick temper and a quicker heart. They were not a crowd to be pitied. They were a chorus waiting to find harmony with a new kind of partner. The program's first session opened in a circle on the lawn. Margaret welcomed families and outlined the work. Paired sessions with dogs trained for calm and sensitivity, routines that built trust, not dependence, goals measured in steps taken, breaths steadied, eyes lifted without flinching. A therapist explained how regulated breathing and grounding touch could interrupt panic. A handler demonstrated asking for consent, a hand offered, a dog's choice to approach. Ranger walked the perimeter once, then settled near Elena's chair, eyes tracking, expression soft. When a child's voice wobbled, he tipped an ear. When hands trembled, he shifted closer. When laughter cut through, he closed his eyes briefly, as if collecting it. Between activities, Elena knelt beside a boy who hesitated at a low balance beam. She tapped her brace lightly, the old metal bright beneath sunlight. "We take it together," she said. "Your pace, not mine." Ranger stepped onto the grass beside the beam and touched his nose to the first plank. The boy grinned despite himself and moved. By afternoon, the grounds had a rhythm. Short walks threaded with pauses, soft commands layered over softer reassurances, breaks that involved leaning into warm fur and learning a new breath. There were no miracles, only a series of unremarkable moments that stacked end to end, looked a lot like one. When the day closed, Margaret locked the file cabinet and stood again under the sign. The sky was cloudless, the air warm. Families trickled to cars, children waving without prompting. Ranger sat, tail sweeping the stones, and looked up as Elena placed a hand on his head. "We brought them here," Elena whispered, voice low and certain. "You showed me how." Margaret rested a hand on each of them. "We'll keep building," she said. "Care is a thing you practice." Ranger leaned into the pressure, and, for a heartbeat, the three of them stood as they had in 100 doorways before, aligned, attentive, braced for whatever came next. Only now, what came next meant choosing to turn outward. That evening, the cottage glowed again, same rooms, new purpose, files, lesson plans, dog toys, flowers on the table. Elena brewed tea with a practiced hand. Ranger settled by the door, not guarding against a threat this time, but welcoming the quiet. Margaret set a framed photo on the mantel, the one the world had seen, a girl, a woman, a dog on courthouse steps. Under it, a smaller one, the three of them covered in garden dirt, laughing. She straightened both, touched Ranger's collar as he passed, and felt gratitude land without fanfare. "We're home," she said, the phrase no longer a plea, but a statement of place. Elena answered with a nod that belonged to the person she had become. Ranger closed his eyes and exhaled. In the hush that followed, it was easy to hear the through line: courage learned in a courtroom, practiced in a kitchen, offered on a field where other children would take their first steady breath in months. Truth had prevailed when it needed to. Love had done what it always does when given the room. It stayed, it steadied, it grew, and in the center of it, old sentry turned gentle guide. Ranger kept time. The foundation had been months in the making. Margaret had poured every ounce of energy and resolve into creating a space where children who had experienced abandonment, trauma, or disability could find both solace and empowerment through interaction with retired police dogs. Every detail was intentional: low fences for accessibility, shaded areas for quiet reflection, open spaces for play and training exercises, and counselors trained to recognize the subtle, unspoken communication between child and dog. The Ranger Trust was not just a facility. It was a promise. A promise that no child would have to face fear or isolation alone. Elena knelt down to greet a small boy who approached hesitantly, his eyes wide as they met the calm gaze of another German Shepherd, one of Ranger's companions in the program. "Hi," she said gently, hand outstretched. "This is Major. He's really friendly. Would you like to pet him?" The boy nodded, voice barely audible, and slowly extended his hand. Major lowered his head, tail wagging in measured patience, and the boy's face lit with a cautious smile. Ranger nudged Elena's side, a reminder of the silent reassurance that had carried her through so many nights of fear, and she squeezed the dog's back, whispering, "We're making a difference, just like you made for me." Margaret watched, eyes shimmering with tears she refused to blink away. This, seeing the children slowly open themselves to trust, seeing the dogs respond with loyalty and calm, this was the culmination of years of pain, courage, and healing. The courtroom battles, the sleepless nights, the near-constant vigilance against a man who had once sought to control and harm them, all of it had led to this. Here, in this sunlit space, filled with hope, justice, and love, had taken tangible form. A mother approached, hesitating as she looked at her daughter, who had been withdrawn and silent for months, following an accident. Margaret stepped forward, voice gentle, explaining the process, the promise, the careful steps they took to match child and dog. Eleanor stood beside her, hand resting lightly on Ranger, and spoke with a quiet authority born of experience. "They understand," she said, eyes meeting the mother's. "They know what it's like to feel alone. The dogs, they'll listen without judgment. They'll remind her that she's not abandoned." The girl slowly extended her hand, and Ranger's companion, a wise older German shepherd named Justice, lowered his head, allowing her to touch his fur. The moment hung in the air, fragile, yet profound. Elena and Margaret exchanged a glance, a silent affirmation of the work they had done, the journey they had endured, and the lives they were now beginning to touch. Later in the afternoon, after the initial introductions and training sessions, the children dispersed to explore the yard under the watchful eyes of volunteers. Elena walked slowly, Ranger by her side, the weight of the day settling into her muscles and bones in a way that was comforting rather than exhausting. She paused at the edge of the path, hand resting on Ranger's broad back, and whispered, almost to herself, "I was never abandoned. I was found. Ranger nudged her gently with his nose, ears perked and eyes alert, as if acknowledging that her words were true, not only for her, but for every child who would come to this place seeking trust and safety. Margaret, standing a few steps behind, felt a lump rise in her throat, the realization that the promise they had made, the love they had nurtured, the battles they had fought, were manifesting in something enduring, something that would outlast them both. As the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the foundation grounds, Eleanor led a small group of children through a gentle exercise, Ranger at the center, guiding, protecting, and silently teaching them confidence and courage. Laughter rang through the air, pure and unguarded, the kind of laughter that had once seemed impossible for her, now spreading like a balm over all that pain had touched. Margaret observed from the porch, heart full, as parents approached with cautious gratitude. Volunteers moved with purpose, and dogs of all sizes and ages responded with loyalty, patience, and gentle guidance. The Ranger Trust was alive, a living testament to resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between humans and dogs. When the day drew to a close, Elena and Ranger stood together at the garden path, watching the last children leave with their parents. Ranger's head rested lightly against her hand, eyes soft and steady, and for a moment, the years of fear, uncertainty, and danger seemed to fall away entirely. Margaret stepped beside them, hand on Elena's shoulder, feeling the warmth and strength that radiated from both the girl and the dog, who had become her constant. "Elena," she said softly, "look at what you've built. Look at what we've built." Elena smiled, her eyes glinting in the fading light. "We didn't just survive," she said, voice steady. "We created something worth living for, something that helps others know they're never truly alone." Ranger let out a soft, approving bark, as if to punctuate the moment, and Eleanor leaned down, pressing her forehead lightly against the dog's, whispering once more, "I was never abandoned. I was found." And in that quiet, golden evening, with the promise of tomorrow stretching beyond the horizon, Margaret, Elena, and Ranger, the small family forged through adversity, knew that hope was no longer fragile. It was strong, enduring, and ready to guide every lost soul who found their way to the Ranger Trust. Sometimes, the simplest moments hold the deepest meaning. A gentle nudge from a loyal German shepherd, a quiet companionship at the end of a long day, or the steadfast presence of a dog who seems to understand your heart without words. These bonds remind us that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's felt in the softest paw steps and the warmest eyes. Dogs teach us patience, empathy, and the courage to trust again, showing that loyalty can be a quiet, unwavering force in our lives. If you've ever wished to connect more deeply with your own dog, to understand their moods, anticipate their needs, or simply share more meaningful moments together, there are gentle guides and resources that can help. One I've found truly heartwarming is insert resource link here, which offers insights, tips, and ideas for strengthening the bond with your furry companion. It's not about training or rules. It's about understanding, respect, and love. Take a quiet moment with your dog today. Notice the little gestures and let them know, in your voice, in your touch, that you see them, you value them, and you're there. The connection you share is a treasure that grows every single day,